He asked 200,000 people to give him $300 each, not for hurricane relief, not for orphans, for a private jet. And tens of thousands of people actually sent the money. That's the story of Creflo Dollar, and it's also the story of a man who decades later stood in front of his own congregation and said the thing he'd taught them for over 30 years was wrong, not misguided, not outdated. Wrong? Today we're breaking down exactly what happened, why it happened, and whether anyone should actually believe it. Let's go back to the beginning, because you can't understand the reversal without understanding what came before it. In 1986, a 25-year-old preacher named Creflo Dollar held his first service in the cafeteria of an elementary school in College Park, Georgia. 8 people showed up. That's it. 8. From that room, Dollar built what would become World Changers Church International, a congregation that eventually swelled to nearly 30,000 members, with satellite campuses stretching across multiple states and a television broadcast called Changing Your World that beamed his sermons into homes around the planet. This wasn't a small operation. This was a religious empire, and it was built on one specific theological engine, the prosperity gospel. Here's how the prosperity gospel works, stripped down to its core mechanics. It teaches that faith operates like a spiritual transaction. You give, God gives back. And not just spiritually, but financially, physically, materially, sickness, poverty, lack. These aren't just bad luck. They're framed as failures of faith or blockages that the right kind of giving can remove. And at the center of that system sits tithing, the practice of handing over 10% of your income to the church, not as a suggestion, but as a requirement, a formula, almost a spiritual law of physics. Give the 10%, unlock the blessing. Withhold it, and you were, in Dollar's own words looking back, kept in something he later admitted was sustained by fear and guilt. For over 3 decades, that was the engine room of his ministry. Sermons on tithing, books on tithing, CDs, DVDs, entire teaching series built around the 10% formula, all sold to a congregation that trusted him completely. And it worked, at least financially. Dollar became one of the wealthiest pastors in America, with an estimated net worth that watchdog researchers placed around $27 million, built on multiple luxury properties, including a Manhattan apartment he purchased for $2.5 million in 2006 and later sold for $3.75 million. A fleet of high-end vehicles that reportedly included 2 Rolls-Royces and, of course, the jets. Because nothing captures the prosperity gospel controversy quite like the airplane saga. In March of 2015, Dollar's ministry launched something called Project G650, a campaign asking 200,000 people to donate $300 or more each to purchase a brand new Gulfstream G650, a jet so exclusive that even billionaires reportedly waited years just to get their names on the list, priced at around $65 million. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Public figures, including gospel artist Kirk Franklin, publicly called it out. The campaign video got pulled within days. But here's the part people forget. It didn't actually stop. A couple of months later, reporting found the fundraising page was still live on the church's website, with the ministry insisting the airplane project was, quote, still moving forward. This wasn't a one-off embarrassment. It became a symbol, the poster child for exactly what critics meant when they said prosperity preachers were extracting wealth from working-class congregants to fund lifestyles those congregants would never come close to living themselves. And it wasn't just internet outrage. The financial practices of Dollar's ministry drew formal scrutiny. Back in 2007, he was one of 6 televangelists investigated by Senator Chuck Grassley's Senate Finance Committee over how church-owned assets were being used personally by ministry leaders. Dollar pushed back hard, arguing that the ears, not a Senate committee, had jurisdiction over religious organizations, and he wasn't entirely wrong on the legal technicalities, which is part of why televangelist finances remain such a murky, under-regulated corner of American nonprofit law to this day. On top of that, independent watchdog Ministry Watch reportedly gave Creflo Dollar Ministries an F grade for financial transparency, largely because the organization declined to open its books to independent audit. So by the early 2020s, you had a preacher sitting on decades of wealth, a congregation of tens of thousands who'd been taught that their financial breakthroughs depended on their tithing faithfully, and a mounting pile of unanswered questions about where exactly all that money had gone. Which brings us to June 26, 2022, the day everything changed, or at least appeared to. Dollar stood up and delivered a sermon titled The Great Misunderstanding, and what he said stunned even people who'd followed his ministry for years. He opened by telling his congregation, quote, "I want to start off by saying to you that I'm still growing, and that the teachings that I've shared in times past on the subject of tithing were not correct." Let that sink in for a second. This is a man who built a 30,000-member megachurch, a television empire, and a personal fortune substantially on the back of tithing theology, standing up and saying it wasn't correct. He went further, diagnosing the entire system with startling bluntness. Religion is sustained by 2 factors: fear and guilt. And if it's one subject that the church has used for a long time to keep people in fear and guilt, it is that subject of tithing. He wasn't just correcting a doctrine, he was naming the emotional manipulation baked into it. Then came the instruction that really set off alarm bells and headlines everywhere. He told his congregants, in his words, to throw away every book, every tape, and every video I have ever done on the subject of tithing. Picture that for a second. Thousands of people who had purchased those materials, who had built their financial decisions around them, being told to discard them entirely. A follow-up sermon just days later, on July 3rd, pushed the point even harder, with Dollar declaring, "I would argue that tithing isn't required or even encouraged for believers in Jesus Christ." His theological justification centered on one specific verse, Romans 6:14, which he used to argue that tithing was an Old Testament concept that had effectively been retired under a New Testament framework of grace. In his framing, Christians are no longer operating under the law, the rules, the formulas, the obligations, but under grace, which changes the entire basis for giving. Giving, going forward, should come from gratitude, not requirement. Now, here's something equally important that Dollar did not do in that sermon, and it's the detail that turned this from a redemption story into a controversy of its own. He did not apologize. He said it directly. "I won't apologize, because if it wasn't for me going down that route, I wouldn't have ended up where I am now." Read that sentence again. He is explicitly saying that the incorrect teaching, the one built on fear and guilt, the one that funded his lifestyle, was a necessary step to get him to where he currently stands. That's not remorse, that's justification. And that single line is arguably the most important sentence in this entire story, because it tells you exactly how Dollar himself frames his own history, not as a mistake to atone for, but as a stepping stone he doesn't regret walking on, regardless of who it cost along the way. So, where has the ministry gone since? This is the part most coverage of the story skips because the jet headlines are juicier than the theology. But the theological pivot is actually the more interesting story. World Changers Church International has since repositioned itself around what's often called the finished work of Christ, a framework that shifts the emphasis away from self-effort, spiritual warfare, and financial breakthrough, and toward identity, grace, and rest. Instead of teaching that believers need to unlock blessings through correct spiritual formulas, the newer teaching emphasizes that believers are already, in theological terms, righteous and forgiven because of what was already accomplished on the cross, nothing left to earn, nothing left to unlock. It's a real and recognizable current within broader evangelical theology, not something Dollar invented. Grace-centered, finished work teaching has deep roots that long predate him. But for a ministry built for 30 years on formulas, breakthroughs, and financial warfare language, this represents a genuine pivot in tone and substance. Sermons that once promised victory over lack now lean into language about rest, security, and settled identity rather than striving. It's a softer, less transactional Christianity, at least on the surface, one that asks less of people's wallets and more of their sense of who they already are. And to be fair, that's not nothing. If you strip away the cynicism for a second, a prosperity preacher publicly renouncing the core financial doctrine of prosperity theology is, structurally, a big deal. It's the equivalent of a company's founder standing up and saying the product they built the business on doesn't actually work the way they claimed. Few people with that much invested, financially, reputationally, ever do that publicly. Some theologians and commentators genuinely welcomed it. Writer Candice Marie Benbow captured that mixed but hopeful reaction well, noting it's refreshing anytime a pastor, especially in that position, is willing to walk something back publicly. There is a version of this story where Dollar is simply a man whose theology matured, who reads scripture differently after decades in ministry, and who was willing to eat the reputational cost of admitting it. That version deserves acknowledgement. But here's where the skepticism comes back in hard. Because a theological shift without financial accountability leaves some very uncomfortable questions completely unanswered. Watchdog investigator Barry Bowen of the Trinity Foundation, who has spent years tracking televangelist finances, put it bluntly, if Dollar really wants to change course, he should abandon his extravagant lifestyle and embrace real financial transparency. And Bowen didn't stop at rhetoric. His reporting noted that Dollar reportedly still owned 2 jets, a Gulfstream GIV and a Learjet 60, registered through a shell company alongside multiple expensive properties. So the theology changed, the teaching changed. But by outside accounts, the lifestyle funded by decades of tithing did not meaningfully change. That's the tension critics keep pointing back to. You can renounce a doctrine on a Sunday morning, but the assets that doctrine generated over 30 years don't just evaporate because you changed the sermon topic. Then there's the refund question, which is maybe the sharpest critique of all. If the teaching was wrong, not just outdated, but wrong, built on fear and guilt as Dollar himself said, what about the people who gave under that pressure? What about congregants who tithed money they arguably couldn't afford, believing it was a spiritual requirement, only to be told years later that the requirement never actually existed? Online reaction captured this pointedly, with one widely shared comment arguing that Dollar needed what it called a Zacchaeus moment, actually offering refunds for the tapes, videos, books, and materials people had purchased under the old teaching, a reference to the biblical tax collector who, upon his own conversion, didn't just apologize, but paid people back. No such refund program has materialized. Faith commentator Kia Morgan-Smith, writing for Black Enterprise, noted that critics specifically requested dollar refund poorer parishioners who'd given under the old system. A request that, as far as public record shows, has gone unanswered. Which leads to the question this whole story ultimately hinges on: is this genuine theological evolution, or is it a strategic rebrand? And honestly, those two things aren't mutually exclusive, which is exactly what makes it so hard to pin down. It's entirely possible for a person to have a real, sincere shift in belief, while that shift also, conveniently, happens to align with what a younger, more skeptical generation of churchgoers wants to hear. Prosperity theology has taken a serious reputational hit over the past decade, especially among younger evangelicals who grew up watching the jet headlines and the financial scandals play out in real time on social media. A softer, grace-centered, less transactional message is simply more marketable to that audience right now. That doesn't automatically make Dollar insincere, but it does mean the shift conveniently serves both his soul and his brand at the exact same moment, and when those two incentives line up that neatly, skepticism is a reasonable response, not a cynical one. So where does that leave us? A preacher spent over 3 decades building a financial empire on a doctrine he now calls a tool of fear and guilt. He walked it back publicly, in his own words, in front of his own congregation, which is more than most religious leaders in his position ever do. But he refused to apologize. He hasn't addressed the wealth that doctrine generated, and by outside reporting. Watchdogs say the lifestyle it funded remains largely intact. The theology moved from law to grace. The bank accounts, as far as anyone outside the ministry can actually verify, don't appear to have moved much at all. Maybe that's the real lesson here, not really about one preacher or one sermon, but about how easy it is to change the message while leaving the machine underneath it completely untouched. Whether Creflo Dollar's turn represents genuine repentance or a well-timed rebrand might honestly be something only he knows for certain. But the questions watchdogs and former followers are asking aren't going away just because the sermon topic did.